Hi guys, it's Miss Carpenter. We're going to read another chapter today of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. When we left off, the White Witch and all of her people who followed her, and they were all very bad creatures. They had just killed Aslan, and Lucy and Susan were in the shadows watching, but they did not see it because they couldn't bear to look and they covered their eyes. And so now we have chapter 15, Deeper Magics from Before the Dawn of Time. While the two girls still crouched in the bushes with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now, follow me all, and we will set about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush that human vermin and the traitors now that great fool, that great cat lies dead." At this moment the children were for a few seconds in very great danger. For with wild cries, the noise of skirling pipes, and the shrills of horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping off the hilltop and down the slope right past the hiding place. They felt the specters go by them like a cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs. And overhead there went a flurry of foul wings and blackness of vultures and giant bats. And at any other time they would have trembled with fear, but now the sadness and shame of horror of Aslan's death so filled their minds that they hardly thought of it. As soon as the wood was silent again, Susan and Lucy crept out onto the open hilltop. The moon was getting low and the clouds were passing across her, but still they could see the shape of the lion lying dead in his bonds. And down they both knelt in the wet grass and kissed his cold face and stroked his beautiful fur, what was left of it, and cried till they could cry no more. And then they looked at each other and held each other's hands for mere loneliness and cried again, and then again were silent. At last it was Lucy who said, "I can't bear to look at that horrible muzzle. I wonder, could we take it off?" So they tried, and after a lot of working at it, for their fingers were cold and it was now the darkest part of the night, they succeeded. And when they saw his face without it, they burst out crying again and kissed it and fondled it and wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could, and it was all more lonely and hopeless and horrid than I know how to describe. "I wonder, could we untie him as well?" said Susan presently. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had drawn the cord so tight that the girls could make nothing of the knots. I hope no one who reads this book has been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you have been, if you've been up all night and cried till you could have no more tears left in you, you will know that there comes in the end a sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing was ever going to happen again. At any rate, that was how it felt for these two. Hours and hours seemed to go by in this dead calm, and they hardly noticed that they were getting colder and colder. But at last Lucy noticed two other things. One was that the sky on the east side of the hill was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago. The other was some tiny movement going on in the grass at her feet. At first she took no interest in this. What did it matter? Nothing mattered now. But at last she saw the whatever it was had begun to move up the upright stones of the stone table. And now whatever they were moving about on Aslan's body. She peered closer. They were little gray things. "Ugh!" said Susan from the other side of the table. "How beastly! There are horrid little mice crawling all over him. Go away, you little beast!" And she raised her hand to frighten them away. "Wait!" said Lucy, who had been looking at them more closely. "Can you see what they're doing?" Both girls bent down and stared. "I do believe, but how odd, they're nibbling away at the cords." "That's what I thought," said Lucy. "I think they're friendly mice. Poor little things. They don't realize he's dead. They think it'll do some good untying him." It was quite definitely lighter by now. Each of the girls noticed for the first time the white face of the other. They could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of little field mice, And at last, one by one, the ropes were all gnawed through. The sky in the east was whitish by now, and the stars were getting fainter, all except one very big one low down on the eastern horizon. They felt colder than they had been all night. The mice crept away again. The girls cleared away the remains of the gnawed ropes, and Aslan looked more like himself without them. Every moment his dead face looked nobler as the light grew and they could see it better. In the wood behind them a bird gave a chuckling sound. It had been so still for hours and hours that it startled them. Then another bird answered it. Soon there were birds singing all over the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, not late night. I'm so cold, said Lucy. So am I, said Susan. Let's walk about a bit. They walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country all looked gray, but beyond, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale. The sky began to turn red. They walked to and fro more times than they could count between the dead Aslan and the eastern ridge, trying to keep warm. And oh, how tired their legs felt. Then at last, as they stood for a moment looking out toward the sea and Cape Paravel, which they could just now make out, the red turned to gold along the line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. And that moment they heard from beyond them a loud noise, a great cracking, deafening noise, as if a giant had broken a giant's plate. What's that? Said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. I, I feel afraid to turn around, said Susan. Something awful is happening. They're doing something worse to him, said Lucy. Come on. And she turned, pulling Susan around with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All colors and shadows were changed, that for a moment they didn't see the important thing. And then they did. The stone table was broken into two pieces by a great crack that ran down from it from end to end, and there was no Aslan. Oh, 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 cried the two girls, rushing back to the table. Oh, it's too bad. They might have left the body alone, sobbed Lucy. Who's done it? Cried Susan. What does it mean? Is it more magic? Yes, said a great voice from behind them. It is more magic. Wonder who it is. They looked around. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for he had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. Oh, Aslan! Cried both the children, staring up at him, almost as frightened as they were glad. Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan? Said Lucy. Not now, said Aslan. You're not, asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. Do I look it? He said. Oh, you're real, you're real. Oh, Aslan, cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. But what does this all mean? Asked Susan when they were somewhat calmer. It means that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still which she did not know. Her knowledge only goes back to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backward. And now, oh yes, now, said Lucy, jumping up and clapping her hands. Oh, children, I feel my strength coming back to me. Oh, children, catch me if you can, said the lion. He stood for a second, his eyes very bright, his limbs quivering and lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a leap high over their heads and landed on the other side of the table, laughing, though she didn't know why. Lucy scrambled over him to reach him. Aslan leaped again. A mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach. Not letting them almost catch his tail, now diving between them, not tossing them in the air with his huge and beautifully velveted paws and catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly so that all three of them rolled over together in a happy, laughing, heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp as no one had ever had except in Narnia, and whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three finally lay together, panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least bit tired or hungry or thirsty. "And now," said Aslan, "to business. I feel I am going to roar. You had better put your fingers in your ears." And they did. And Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face became so terrible but that they did not dare to look at it, and they all saw all the trees in front of him bend before the blast of his roaring, as grass bends in a meadow before the wind. Then he said, "We have a long journey to go. You must ride on my back," and he crouched down, and the children climbed onto his warm golden back, and Susan sat first, holding on tightly to his mane, and Lucy sat behind, holding on tightly to Susan. And with a great heave he rose underneath them, and then shot off faster than any other horse could go, downhill and into the thick of the forest. That ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that ever happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever had a gallop on a horse? Think of that, and then take away the heavy noise of the hoofs and the jingle of the bits, and imagine instead of almost noiseless padding of great paws. Then imagine instead of the black or gray or chestnut back of the horse the soft roughness of golden fur, and the mane flying back in the wind. And then imagine you are going about twice as fast as the fastest racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushes on, and never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between tree trunks, jumping over bush and briar and the smaller streams, wading the larger and swimming in the largest of all. And you are riding not on the road, nor in a park or even on the downs, but right across Narnia in spring, down solemn avenues of beech and across sunny glades of oak, and through wild orchards and of snow-white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks and echoing caverns, up windy slopes alight with gorse bushes, and across the shoulders of heathery mountains, and along giddy ridges, and down again into wild valleys, and out into the acres of blue flowers. It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down a steep hillside at a castle, a little toy castle it looked from where they stood, which seemed to be all pointed towers. But the lion was rushing down at such a speed that it grew larger every moment, and before they had time to even ask themselves what it was, they were already on a level with it. And now it is no longer looked like a toy castle, but rose frowning in front of them. No face looked over the battlements, and the gates were fast shut, and Aslan, not at all slacking his pace, rushed straight as a bullet toward it. "The witch is home!" he cried. "Now, children, hold tight!" The next moment the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them, for the lion had gathered himself together for a greater leap than any had yet made and jumped, or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back in the middle of a wide stone courtyard full of statues. Chapter 16. What happened about the statues? "What an extraordinary place!" cried Lucy. "All those stone animals and people too. It's like a museum." "Hush," said Susan. "Aslan's doing something." He was indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion and breathed on him. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked around almost as if he had been a cat chasing its tail, and breathed also on the stone dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on a tall stone dryad which stood beyond the dwarf, turned rapidly aside to deal with the stone rabbit on his right, and rushed on to two centaurs. But at that moment Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at the lion." I expect you've seen someone put a lighted match to a bit of newspaper which is propped up in a grate against an unlit fire, and for a second nothing seems to have happened, and then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping along the edge of the newspaper. It was like that now. For a second after Aslan had breathed upon him, the stone line looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back. Then it spread, and then the color seemed to lick all over him as flame licks all over a bit of paper. Then, while his hind quarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane, and all the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. Then he opened a great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a prodigious yawn, and now his hind legs had come to life. He lifted one of them and scratched himself, then having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him and frisking around him, whimpering with delight and jumping up to lick his face. Of course the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful that they soon forgot about him. Everywhere the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum. It looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing around him till he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white, the courtyard was now a blaze of color. Glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, reddy brown of foxes, dogs and satyrs, and yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarfs, and the birch girls in silver, and the beech girls in fresh transparent green, and the larch girls in green so bright that it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with the sound of happy roarings, brayings, yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts, hurrays, songs, and laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone, "look, is it safe?" Lucy looked and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the feet of the stone giant. "It's all right," shouted Aslan joyously. "Once the feet are put right, all the rest of him will follow." "That wasn't exactly what I meant," whispered Susan to Lucy, but it was too late to do anything about it. Now, even if Aslan would have listened to her, the change was already creeping up the giant's leg. Now he was moving his feet. A moment later he lifted the club off his shoulder, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Bless me, I must have fallen asleep. Now, where's that dratted little witch that was running about on the ground? Somewhere just by my feet it was." But when everyone else shouted up to him to explain what had really happened, and when the giant had put his hand to his ear to get them to repeat it all again so that at last he understood, then he bowed down till his head was no further off the top of the haystack and touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan, beaming all over his honest, ugly face. Giants of any sort are now so rare in England, and so few giants are good-tempered, that 10 to 1 you have never seen a giant when his face is beaming. It's a sight well worth looking at. "Now for the inside of the house," said Aslan. "Look alive, everyone, upstairs, downstairs, and in my lady's chamber. Leave no corner unsearched. You never know where some poor prisoner may have been concealed." And into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible, fusty old castle echoed with the opening of windows and with everyone's voices crying out, "Don't forget the dungeons! Give us a hand with this door! Here's another little winding stairway! Oh, I say, here's a poor kangaroo! Call Aslan! Phew, how it smells in here! Look out for trap doors! Up here! There are a whole lot more on the landing!" But the best of all was when Lucy came rushing upon upstairs, shouting out, "Aslan! Aslan! I found Mr. Tumnus! Oh, do come quick!" A moment later Lucy and the little fawn were holding each other by the hands and dancing around and around for joy. The little chap was none the worse for having been a statue, and was of course very interested in all she had to tell him. But at last the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended. The whole castle stood empty, with every door and window open, and the light and the sweet spring air flooding into all the dark and evil places which needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and it was then that someone, Tumnus, I think, first said, "But how are we to get out?" For Aslan had gotten in by a jump, and the gates were still locked. "That'll be all right," said Aslan. And then rising on his hind legs, he bawled up at the giant, "Hi, you up there! What's your name?" "Well, I'm the giant Rubblebuffin, if it is please your honor." And the giant once more touching his cap, "Well then, giant Rumblebuffin, Just let us out of this, will you?" "Certainly, your honor. It will be a pleasure," said Giant Rumblebuffin. "Stand well away from the gates, all you little uns." Then he strode to the gate himself, and bang, 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 automatopoeia again, went his huge club. The gates creaked at the first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust cleared, it was odd, standing in that dry, grim, stony yard, to see through the gap of all the grass and waving trees and sparkling streams of the forest, and the blue hills beyond them, and beyond them the sky. "Blowed if I ain't all in a muck sweat," said the giant, puffing like the largest railway engine. Simile. "Comes out of being out of condition, I suppose. Neither of you young ladies has such a thing as a pocket handkerchief about you?" "Yes, I have one," said Lucy, standing on tiptoes and holding her handkerchief up as far as she could reach. "Thank you, Missy," said the giant Rumblebuffin, stooping down. The next moment Lucy got a rather fright, for she found herself caught in mid-air between the giant's finger and thumb. But just as she was getting near his face, he suddenly started and then put her gently back on the ground, muttering, "Bless me, I've picked up a little girl instead. I beg your pardon, Missy. I thought you was the handkerchief." "No, no," said Lucy, laughing. "Here it is." This time he managed to get it, but it was only about the same size to him that a saccharin tablet would be to you. So that when she saw him suddenly rubbing it to and fro across his red face, she said, "I'm afraid it's not much use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin." "Not at all, not at all. Never met a nicer handkerchief. So fine, so handy. So I don't know how to describe it." "What a nice giant he is," said Lucy to Mr. Tumnus. "Oh, yes," replied the fawn. "All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. I never knew a giant that was. But an old family, with traditions, you know. If he'd been the other sort, she'd never have turned him into stone." At this point, Aslan clapped his paws together and called for silence. "Our day's work is not over, and if the witch is to be finally defeated before bedtime, we must find the battle at once." "And join in, I hope, sire," added the largest of the centaurs. "Of course. And now, those who can't keep up, that is, children, dwarfs, and small animals, must ride on the backs of those who can. That would be lions and centaurs and unicorns and horses and giants and eagles. Those who are good with their noses must come in the front with us lions to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves." And with a great deal of bustle and jeering they did. The most pleased of lot was the other lion, who kept running about everywhere, pretending to be busy, but really in order to say to everyone he met, "Did you hear what he said? Us lions. That means him and me. Us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No side, no standoffness. Us lions. That meant him and me." At last he went on saying this till Aslan had loaded him with the three dwarfs, one dryad, two rabbits, and a hedgehog. That steadied him a bit. When they were all ready, it was the big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan most in getting them all sorted into the proper order. They set out through the gap in the castle wall. At first the lions and dogs went nosing about in all directions, but then suddenly one great hound picked up the scent and gave a bay. There was no time lost after that. Soon all the dogs and lions and wolves and other hunting animals were all going at full speed with their noses to the ground, and all the others, streaked out for about a half a mile behind them, were following as fast as they could. The noise was like an English fox hunt, only better, because every now and then the music of the hounds was mixed in with the roar of the other lion, and sometimes far deeper and more awful roar of Aslan himself. Faster and faster they went as the scent became easier and easier to follow. And then, just as they came to the last curve in a narrow, winding valley, Lucy heard above all these noises another noise, a different one, which gave her a queer feeling inside. It was the noise of shouts and of shrieks and of clashing of metal against metal. Then they came out of the narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There stood Peter and Edmund and all the rest of Aslan's army, fighting desperately against the crowd of horrible creatures whom she had seen last night. Only now in the daylight they looked even stranger and more evil and more deformed. There also seemed to be far more of them. Peter's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few, and there were statues dotted all over the battlefield, so apparently the witch had been using her wand. But she did not seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her stone knife. It was Peter she was fighting, both of them going at it so hard that Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. She only saw the stone knife and Peter's sword flashing so quickly that they looked like three knives and three swords. That pair were in the center. On each side of the lion stretched out. Horrible things were happening wherever she looked. "Off my back, children!" shouted Aslan, and they both tumbled off. Then, with a roar that shook all of Narnia from the western lamp post to the shores of the eastern sea, the great beast flung himself upon the white witch. Lucy saw her face lifted toward him for 1 second, and with an expression of terror and amazement. Then lion and witch had rolled over together, but with the witch underneath, and at the same moment all warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed madly on the enemy lines, dwarfs with their battle axes, dogs with their teeth, the giant with his club, and his feet also crushed dozens of foes. Unicorns with their horns, centaurs with their swords and hoofs, and Peter's tired army cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemy squealed and gibbered till the wood re-echoed with the din of that onset. And we will find out the next 2 chapters tomorrow. Bye, guys.